Hey there, viewers. Before we get into this chilling story, let's hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments. Today's story comes from someone who experienced Diddy's world firsthand, and what they reveal about 2019 is something they can never forget. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Man No One Dares to Expose. The email arrived at exactly 2:37 a.m. At first, I thought it was spam. The subject line was vague. You need to see this. Normally, I wouldn't even open something like that, not with the kind of inbox I have. After years of chasing down leads, I've learned that most of these messages are either hoaxes, threats, or dead ends. But something about this one made me pause. Maybe it was the timing. Maybe it was the way my gut twisted before I even clicked on it. The moment I opened the email, I knew this wasn't just another crackpot theory. I was there in 2019. He made me do something I'll never forget. If you want the truth, meet me in person. No cameras, no recordings. There was no sender name, no signature, just those chilling words. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. I'd been a journalist for over a decade. I've covered everything from political corruption to human trafficking rings. But this was different. It wasn't just another tip or leaked document. It was a direct invitation into something bigger, something I wasn't sure I was ready for. Because I knew exactly who he was, and I knew that getting too close to him was a dangerous game. For years, I had tried to crack the world of Sean Diddy Combs. I'd spoken to former employees, partygoers, even a few low-level industry insiders. Everyone had a story, but no one ever had proof, not the kind that could survive a lawsuit at least. Every time I got close, the same thing happened. Sources disappeared. Emails stopped being answered. People I had spoken to suddenly changed their minds, claiming they misremembered things. One woman, an ex-dancer who had worked at one of his infamous house parties, had agreed to go on record. She gave me details, horrific ones. She told me about men passed out in rooms, girls who looked barely legal, cameras everywhere. She said she had heard things she wasn't supposed to hear. 3 days before our scheduled interview, she called me, panicked. "I can't do this," she whispered. "They know." I tried to get her to explain who, how, but she just hung up. I never heard from her again. That was 2 years ago. Since then, I'd backed off, not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. You can't publish a story with no witnesses, and against someone with Diddy's power, a half-baked article wasn't just career suicide, it was real suicide. But now, out of nowhere, this email shows up. Someone who had been there in 2019, someone who wanted to talk. For the first time in a long time, I felt it again, the rush of a story that could change everything. I spent the next 2 hours trying to trace the sender. Nothing. The email was routed through multiple VPNs, encrypted beyond anything I could break. Whoever sent it knew what they were doing. They didn't want to be found. Which left me with only one question. Was this real? Or was it a setup? I've seen it happen before. Big names set traps for journalists all the time. They dangle a fake source, feed them disinformation, and then destroy their credibility when the story falls apart. And with someone like Diddy, it wouldn't be the first time. Still, something about this felt different. The wording in the email, it wasn't some random conspiracy theory. It wasn't riddled with exaggeration or paranoia. It was simple, direct, and that made it so much worse. Because whoever sent it wasn't looking for attention. They were trying to survive. I knew I had to make a decision. If I ignored the email, I'd be letting another possible source slip away, maybe the only source who had ever gotten this close. But if I walked into a trap, I might not be walking out. I grabbed my phone, hesitating before I typed out my reply. "Boer and wed?" Less than 5 minutes later, I got an answer. "Tomorrow, 10 p.m., no phone, no mic, no questions about my name." No name, no proof of identity, just a shadow meeting in the dark. I swallowed hard, staring at the message. For years I had been chasing this story. Now it was chasing me. I spent the rest of the day doing my homework. If this was real, if I was actually about to meet someone who worked directly under Diddy, I needed to be ready. I pulled up old records, accusations, NDAs, leaked party footage, anything connected to 2019. The deeper I dug, the clearer the pattern became. A spike in hush payments that year. Large, unexplained transactions from accounts linked to Combs Enterprises. At least 3 sudden resignations from high-level employees, all of whom disappeared from the public eye. A lawsuit that was filed, then quietly dropped. And then there were the parties. 2019 was the year of Wild King nights. I had heard the phrase before, whispered among industry insiders. They were said to be Diddy's most extreme, most exclusive gatherings. Invite only, phones confiscated. No one ever spoke about what really happened at them. And now this anonymous source was claiming to have been there. By the time 10 p.m. rolled around, I was sitting in my car, hands gripping the wheel. I was parked outside a run-down diner on the outskirts of town. The meeting location wasn't what I expected. No hotel, no club, no high-end bar. Just a quiet, forgettable place where no one would think to look. Through the rain-smeared windshield, I spotted a figure standing near the entrance. A man in a hooded jacket. He wasn't looking around. He wasn't on his phone. He just stood there, staring straight ahead, like he was forcing himself to go through with this. I took a deep breath. This was it. I grabbed my notebook, left my phone behind as instructed, and stepped out of the car. The man turned as I approached. Even in the dim light, I could see it. The fear in his eyes. He didn't need to say anything. I already knew. Whatever happened to him in 2019, he still wasn't over it. And now, neither was I. Chapter 2. The Anonymous Whistleblower. The bar was nearly empty. It was the kind of place that felt forgotten, tucked away in a rundown part of town where neon signs buzzed and flickered weakly, where the air smelled of old beer and damp wood. The kind of place where people didn't go to be seen. They went to disappear. I stood at the entrance for a moment, scanning the dimly lit space. A handful of regulars were hunched over the bar, their conversations muted, their focus on half-empty glasses. A lone bartender flipped through a newspaper, barely sparing me a glance. A jukebox in the corner sat unused, coated in a thin layer of dust. And then I saw him. He was tucked away in the farthest booth, shadowed against the wall, his hood pulled low over his face. The man from the diner. He wasn't drinking. In front of him sat an empty glass, his fingers gripping it so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. Every few seconds, his eyes flicked toward the entrance, his posture stiff, as if he was waiting for someone, or something, to burst through the doors. I approached slowly, keeping my movements measured. I had seen this kind of fear before, the kind that didn't fade, the kind that settled into your bones and never let go. "Mind if I sit?" I asked. He hesitated, his fingers twitching around the glass. Then, finally, he nodded. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick, stretching longer than was comfortable. I knew better than to rush it. People like him, they needed time. They weren't just telling a story. They were risking something by telling it. He exhaled sharply, his grip on the glass loosening just a fraction. "You didn't bring your phone, right?" "No phone," I confirmed. "No mic, no recording." His shoulders dropped slightly, but he didn't relax. "Good," he muttered. His voice was low, barely above a whisper. "No names. We don't say names out loud. Not mine, not his." I nodded. His legs started bouncing under the table, his fingers now drumming against the surface, restless. His eyes darted around again, scanning the room like he expected someone to be watching, listening. "I need you to understand something before we start," he said. This isn't just about what you think it is. It's bigger than that." I stayed quiet, waiting. His fingers kept tapping. "It's not just about the parties or the girls or the money," he swallowed. "It's about control." But the man kept talking. The way he said it, the weight behind the word, sent a chill up my spine. I leaned in slightly. "Control how?" He exhaled, rubbing his face with his hands. "You ever wonder why nobody ever speaks out? Why even the people who leave never say a damn word?" I'd spent years trying to figure it out. The NDAs explained some of it, the money explained the rest. But fear? Fear was the thing I could never fully grasp. Until now. He inhaled deeply, as if steadying himself. Then finally, he spoke. I was his senior executive assistant. His voice wavered slightly on the last word. Not just an assistant, not just some intern. I was in the room. I saw everything. I handled things nobody else wanted to handle. A bitter chuckle. Hell, sometimes I didn't even want to handle them. My pulse quickened. This was it. This was the kind of access no one had ever given me before. I thought I could deal with it, you know? He shook his head. I told myself it was just a job, that I could keep my head down, do my work, and leave when the time was right. A pause, then his voice dropped lower. But you don't just leave that world. His eyes flicked up to mine, and for the first time I saw the depth of something ugly behind them. Not when you've seen what I've seen. I swallowed. What did you see? His fingers gripped the edge of the table. For a moment I thought he wouldn't answer, that the fear was too much. Then, they called it loyalty tests. My stomach twisted. I thought they were just stories, he admitted. Rumors, industry bullshit. His jaw clenched. Until it happened to me. The air between us shifted. Everything in the bar, the quiet hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, faded into the background. What did they make you do? I asked carefully. He shook his head. Not here, not now. I kept my voice steady. Then when? He exhaled through his nose. His hands were shaking. You don't get it. This isn't some hazing ritual. It's not some prove yourself bullshit like you see in movies. His voice dropped even lower. This is about breaking you. My throat went dry. It's what he does, he said. He finds your weakness. He finds what you won't do, and then he makes you do it. A chill ran down my spine. For the first time since I had sat down, he looked directly at me, and in his eyes I saw it. Fear, but not just fear. Guilt. Regret. Something worse. Ever again, I wasn't the only one, he whispered. His voice was raw, stripped of all pretense. I felt my stomach drop. There were others. He swallowed, his throat bobbing. His fingers were clenched so tightly around the glass now that I thought it might crack. And I think some of them... He hesitated. His eyes darkened. I think some of them didn't make it out. The weight of his words settled over me like a suffocating fog. I opened my mouth to say something, anything. But for the first time in my career, I didn't know what to say. Chapter 3. Inside the Loyalty Test. For a long moment, I didn't say anything. I didn't even move. I just sat there, staring at him, trying to process what he had just told me. Some of them didn't make it out. The words echoed in my mind, heavy and suffocating. The air in the bar suddenly felt thick, the dim yellow light casting long shadows across his face. I could hear the muffled clinking of glasses from the bartender, the low murmur of distant conversations. But it all felt distant, like the rest of the world had faded into nothing. It was just him and me. His fingers curled tightly around his glass, his knuckles a stark white. Then, slowly, he pulled up the sleeve of his jacket. That's when I saw it. A deep purple bruise just below his wrist. It wasn't the kind of bruise you got from bumping into something. It was the kind you got from someone grabbing you, holding you, not letting go. I swallowed. Who did that to you? He tugged the sleeve back down, shaking his head. Doesn't matter. I met his eyes. It does. For a second, I thought he was going to tell me. His lips parted like he was on the verge of saying something. Something important. Important. But then, just as quickly, he shook his head again, more forcefully this time. His leg bounced under the table, his entire body wired with restless energy. I shouldn't have come here, he muttered. Panic, that's what this was. Panic and regret. He was second-guessing himself. I could see it, clear as day. If I let him leave now, I'd lose him. I had to keep him talking. You said it was about control, I reminded him, keeping my voice steady. Not just sex. Control. His breath hitched. I could feel it now, the weight of whatever he was holding back. It was pressing against him, filling his lungs, suffocating him. I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice. What happened that night? He exhaled sharply. Then, finally, I'll tell you, it was a Saturday. He remembered that much. Not because the date mattered, but because by then he had already been 3 days deep into one of Diddy's infamous Wild King nights. It wasn't just some house party, he said, his voice hollow. It was something else. Phones were taken at the door. Security was everywhere. No cameras, no leaks, no evidence. You didn't just leave when you wanted to, he continued. You left when Diddy was done with you. A chill ran down my spine. There were rules, he said. Unspoken, but clear. You don't ask questions, you don't look uncomfortable, and you never ever say no. That was the first thing he learned as Diddy's senior executive assistant, that saying no wasn't an option. But I didn't really get it, he admitted. Not at first. I thought it was just, I don't know, rich people shit, crazy parties, drugs, women, all that. He shook his head, letting out a dry, humorless chuckle. It was so fucking naive. I felt the weight of what he was saying. Because this wasn't just some assistant telling me about a bad night on the job. This was someone who had been made to do something against his will. And he wasn't sure if he would ever be okay again. The call came at midnight, he said. Diddy wanted him upstairs. Not in the main party area, not in one of the side lounges. Upstairs. That was when he knew something was wrong. Because only a select few ever went upstairs. It was the private floor, the one with locked doors, the one where whatever happened inside never left. And once you were invited, you had no choice but to go. I didn't even have time to think, he said. A security guy came up behind me, tapped my shoulder, and just said, "Come on, he wants you." "Did you try to get out of it?" I asked. He laughed, but there was no humor in it, just bitterness. You don't get out of things with him. He followed the security guard up the winding staircase, past the velvet ropes, through a hallway lined with doors. The music from the party downstairs faded with every step, until it was nothing but a distant hum. Then they stopped in front of a door, and the guard knocked 3 times. The door opened just enough for him to see a glimpse inside. Women, music, dim lights. Diddy was sitting on a massive couch, his legs spread, a drink in his hand. There were at least 5 other people in the room, some of them barely clothed, some already lost in whatever high they were chasing. And then Diddy looked at him and smiled. "What did he say?" I asked. He exhaled. He said, "Come in, King. Prove your loyalty." That was the moment everything changed. Because this wasn't a request, it wasn't a test, it was an order. "And handed me a condom," he muttered. "Told me to pick someone." My stomach twisted. I wanted to say something, but I couldn't. Because what was there to say? He wet his lips, looking past me like he was somewhere else, somewhere he didn't want to be. I froze, he admitted. I didn't know what to do. I kept thinking, if I said no, what would happen to me? I didn't need to ask what he meant. I already knew. You said people who refused were blackballed, I reminded him. He nodded. Or worse. My skin went cold. Because I had heard rumors before. People who had gotten on Diddy's bad side, employees who had been taken care of, people who had vanished. Was that what he meant? Had he actually seen something? Did you say no? I asked. He swallowed hard. I wanted to. Did you? His jaw clenched, then he shook his head. No, he whispered. I didn't. I closed my eyes. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Because what do you even say to something like that? I could see the shame in his eyes, the way his fingers gripped the edge of the table like he wanted to dig himself into the wood and disappear. And the worst part? I knew this was just the beginning of his story. I should have walked away after that night, he muttered, but I didn't, because once you say yes the first time, his voice trailed off. I already knew how that sentence ended. Once you say yes the first time, it's easier to say yes the second, and the third, and the fourth, until eventually you don't recognize yourself anymore. Until it's too late to leave. Chapter 4. The Secrets Buried in 2019. 2019 was a black hole. The more I looked, the more it became obvious. Something happened that year. Not just the usual scandals, not just whispers of excess and parties spiraling out of control. This was different. It wasn't just that there were rumors about what happened that year. It was the fact that so much had been wiped clean. Lawsuits that had been quietly dismissed. Employees who had abruptly resigned and disappeared without a trace. Wire transfers with no clear explanation. Entire pieces of the story were missing. For years, I had been circling around this void, trying to figure out what I was missing. And now, thanks to the assistant's story, I finally knew where to start. I went for the money first. Because if there's one thing I've learned in this job, it's that money never lies. You can hide people, you can bury lawsuits, you can scrub online records, but money always leaves a trail. And that's exactly what I found. Between July and December 2019, there was a massive spike in wire transfers coming out of accounts linked to Combs Enterprises. Some of these transactions were hundreds of thousands of dollars, others were smaller, $50,000 here, $25,000 there, just enough to convince someone to walk away. But here's what made it suspicious. The payments weren't going to business partners. They weren't listed as legal settlements. They weren't charitable donations. They were individuals. Names that at first glance had no clear public connection to Diddy. But when I started digging, a pattern emerged. They all worked for him, and they all left within months of each other. Assistants, housekeepers, personal security, drivers. Most had signed NDAs. Some had relocated. And at least 3 of them had completely vanished. No social media, no forwarding address, no public records past 2019. Like they had been erased. I needed more. I spent the next 3 days combing through legal records. Most of it was exactly what I expected. Lawsuits from former business partners, disputes over royalties, the usual financial battles of a billionaire who had built his empire on power and intimidation. But then, buried beneath stacks of redacted documents, I found her. A woman who had tried to fight back. Her name had been scrubbed from the internet. No social media, no online presence. But there it was, a lawsuit, filed in November 2019, accusing Combs Enterprises of workplace misconduct, coercion, and emotional distress. She had worked for him, and then she had tried to take him to court. The case never made it to trial. It was dismissed 3 weeks later. And when I checked the records, she received a 6-figure payout 2 days after the lawsuit disappeared. And then, just like the others, she vanished. It wasn't enough. I needed someone who had seen it firsthand, someone who could tell me in their own words what happened in 2019. So I reached out to another former associate, someone who had worked for Diddy around that time but had somehow managed to stay out of the headlines. They agreed to meet, but not in a cafe, not in a bar. We met in a parking garage. That alone told me everything I needed to know about how scared they were. They refused to sit in my car. They refused to be near any kind of recording device. Their voice trembled when they spoke. "I know what you're looking for." I swallowed. "Then help me understand." They let out a humorless laugh. "You think you understand. You don't. Not yet." I said nothing. I just waited. Then, the loyalty tests. They shook their head, looking at the concrete floor like it physically hurt them to remember. Yeah, they were real. A cold weight settled in my gut. "I saw things," they continued. Their voice was barely above a whisper. "Things I wish I hadn't." I forced myself to stay calm. "Like what?" They hesitated. "Then, people being forced to do things they weren't okay with, but they did them anyway because they were scared of what would happen if they didn't." My stomach twisted. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I wanted to press for more, but I could see how much it was costing them to even say this much. They glanced around, paranoid. Then, almost like an afterthought, they added, "He doesn't just have money, he has people. People who make problems go away." A shiver ran down my spine. I took a slow breath. "What do you mean?" They didn't answer. Instead, they just stepped back and whispered, "Don't publish this, not unless you're ready for what comes next." Then they turned and walked away. I didn't sleep that night. I had more pieces of the puzzle than ever before. But for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to see the full picture. I replayed everything in my head. The assistant, the ex-employee, the documents, the money, the disappearances. And then, the voicemail. It had come in weeks ago from an unlisted number. I had ignored it at the time, assuming it was another dead-end tip. But now it meant something. I played it again. The voice was low, slurred, unmistakable. "Phil, I need some Cialis." A pause, a faint shuffle in the background. "Get me 20 Xanax, and some Plan B. Oh, and do we have any more chocolates? She's gonna need a chocolate in a minute." My skin went cold. This wasn't just hearsay anymore. This was real. I pressed replay. The voice crackled through my phone again. "Get me 20 Xanax, and some Plan B." I sat in the dark, gripping my phone so tight my fingers hurt. There was no coming back from this. I could feel it, and so could he. Morning came. I had barely gotten 2 hours of sleep when my phone vibrated. A text message from the assistant. "I need to see you now." Nothing else. I stared at the screen, my heart beat loud in my ears. Something was wrong. I grabbed my jacket, shoved my phone into my pocket, and headed for the door. Chapter 5. The footage he tried to erase. He was shaking. Not the slight tremor of nervousness, not the anxious tapping of fingers against the table. He was shaking like a man who had seen something he wasn't supposed to see. His hands were clenched together, fingers digging into his skin. His eyes kept darting to the entrance of the bar, his shoulders tense like he was expecting someone to drag him out at any second. I waited. People like him didn't need pushing. They needed space. Finally, he exhaled. "I don't know why I kept it." I frowned. Kept what? He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, closing his fist around it before I could see. His fingers uncurled just enough for me to catch a glimpse. A black flash drive. Nothing special, just a standard USB stick, the kind you could pick up in any electronics store. But the way he held it, like it was radioactive, told me everything. "What's on it?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he just whispered, "If they find out I kept it, I'm dead." I stared at him. My pulse pounded in my ears, a steady, heavy beat. This wasn't just another piece of information. It wasn't like the NDAs, the money transfers, the whispers of things that had happened behind locked doors. This was proof. And proof? Proof got people killed. He rubbed his face with his hands. "You don't get it," he muttered. "I was supposed to wipe everything. Every video, every text, every picture. I was supposed to erase all of it." I leaned in. "You were in charge of deleting things?" He nodded slowly. I let that sink in. Phones, laptops, hard drives, if something existed and it shouldn't, it was my job to get rid of it. His voice was tight, forced. But sometimes, before I deleted stuff, I saw things. His hand twitched, fingers clenching around the flash drive again. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "What kind of things?" He didn't speak right away. I could tell he was debating whether to tell me at all. Finally, he let out a slow breath. "It started with pictures," he admitted. "That's what I dealt with the most." I kept quiet, letting him talk. The kind of pictures that could ruin careers. Celebrities, executives, politicians. He let out a dry, humorous chuckle. "Diddy kept everything. People think he's reckless, but he's not. He's smart. He knows that sometimes the best way to control someone is to have something on them." He ran a hand through his hair. "The photos were bad enough, but the videos?" He trailed off. My stomach turned. "What was in the videos?" He swallowed. "Stuff no one was supposed to see. The parties, the girls, the... His voice broke off. He shook his head. "If I tell you, it'll be worse. You'll start asking the kind of questions that get people disappeared." That didn't sit right with me. "You don't think this needs to be exposed?" I pressed. His laugh was bitter. "Of course it does. But do you think it's that simple?" He leaned forward, his voice lower now. "You think you can just put this out there and walk away?" I felt something cold settle in my chest. I glanced at the flash drive again. "You said you saw something one night," I said. "Something you weren't supposed to see." His fingers tightened around it. "Yeah. And you copied it." A sharp nod. I tried to keep my voice even. "What was it?" He didn't answer. Instead, his legs started bouncing again. His jaw clenched. His eyes flicked to the entrance of the bar again, scanning for someone who wasn't there. Whatever was on that drive, it was enough to make him think someone might come looking for it. "I need you to understand something," he said finally. This isn't just about him. It's not just about Diddy." My brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" He exhaled, rubbing his forehead like his brain physically hurt from thinking about it. "This goes beyond him. There are other people in those videos. People who have way more power than him." I frowned. "Like who?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "That's the problem," he muttered. "I don't know all their names. I don't want to know, but trust me, if you put this out there, you won't just be exposing him." He looked up at me. "You'll be making enemies in places you don't even know exist." A heavy silence fell between us. I felt the weight of what he had just said, the sheer gravity of it, because he was right. Diddy wasn't some lone wolf operating in the shadows. He was part of something bigger, something deeper, something that didn't just control people, it owned them. My chest tightened. "Where are you giving this to me?" I asked. His leg stopped bouncing. He swallowed. "Because I need someone to know the truth," he said quietly. "Even if I don't make it." My fingers curled against the table. I didn't want to think about that. But he did. He already had. He pushed the flash drive toward me. I stared at it. This small, insignificant object. I had spent years chasing a story that never had proof. And now I was holding it in my hands. I slid the drive into my pocket, my heart pounding. He let out a slow breath. "I hope you know what you're doing," he muttered. I didn't. Not even close. But I nodded anyway. And then I got up, walked out of the bar, and disappeared into the night. Chapter 6. The Federal Connection. The world felt different after I took the flash drive. Not in some dramatic, life flashing before my eyes kind of way. More like a low, pressing weight in my chest that refused to go away. A constant whisper in the back of my head, telling me I had just crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I drove straight home that night, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I didn't plug the drive in. Not yet. Not because I wasn't dying to see what was on it, but because I needed to think first. I needed to be smart. Because if everything the assistant had told me was true, if this wasn't just about Diddy but about something bigger, then this wasn't just about publishing a story anymore. This was about survival. I spent the next morning digging into the courts. The legal system is a messy, tangled beast, but if you know where to look, you can find patterns. In the first pattern I found, Diddy's name had been appearing in sealed cases for months. The documents themselves were locked tight, federal court records with limited access. That was the first red flag. If these were just civil lawsuits, they'd be public. But these weren't. These were criminal. And when I cross-referenced the case numbers, that's when I found it. A grand jury investigation. And not just any grand jury, a federal one. The US government was quietly building a case against Diddy. I sat back, staring at my screen. I knew Diddy had been dealing with lawsuits. His name had been dragged through the mud for months. Allegations of abuse, coercion, trafficking. But this wasn't the same thing. Civil cases were one thing. Federal investigations were another. This meant the government was after him. And they weren't just looking for money. They were looking to put him away. I needed to know more. So I made a call. I had a contact, a former DOJ prosecutor who owed me a favor. He picked up on the third ring. "You're calling me early," he said, voice groggy. I skipped the small talk. "I need information on an active federal grand jury case." That woke him up. "What kind of case?" I hesitated. "Sean Combs." A long silence. Then, "No." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean, I'm not touching that case." I heard movement on his end, a door shutting, a lock clicking. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "Whatever you think you know, whatever you think you're chasing, drop it." A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. "I mean, because you're playing with fire," he said, "and these aren't the kind of people you want knocking on your door." I gripped the phone tighter. "So you do know something." A pause, then quieter. Drab shrugged. "I know enough to keep my mouth shut." Then the line went dead. I sat there for a long time, phone still in my hand. The way he had reacted, that wasn't normal. I had called him about sensitive cases before. He had always at least given me something, a hint, a name, a direction to look. But this was different. Whatever was happening behind those sealed court documents, it wasn't just another celebrity scandal. It was dangerous. I went back to my research, my fingers moving faster now, my mind racing. If the DOJ was involved, that meant federal agents were already watching him. And if they were watching him, then there was a chance they were watching the people around him. A sinking feeling formed in my gut. I pulled up an encrypted messaging app and typed out a quick message to the assistant. "We need to meet. Now." I hit send. 3 dots appeared. Then they vanished. Then appeared again. Finally a response. "Too late." My pulse spiked. I started to type back. "What do you mean? What happened?" Before I could send it, a second message popped up. "They know I talk." My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed my keys and was out the door before I even knew where I was going. I checked my mirrors 4 times before pulling into the parking lot. I wasn't paranoid. I was being careful. The assistant was already there, pacing near a car with tinted windows. He looked worse than before. sweat beading at his temple, hands shaking at his sides. I barely got out of the car before he grabbed me by the arm. "You have to drop this," he hissed. I yanked my arm free. "What happened?" His eyes darted around. "I went back home after we met, thought I was fine, but then..." He swallowed hard. I felt my stomach twist. "Saw who?" "I don't know." He wiped his palms on his jeans. "Black SUV, no plates, parked down the block, stayed there all night." I took a slow breath. "You think it's them?" He gave me a look. Of course it was them. A sharp ring cut through the silence. I stiffened. "My phone." I pulled it out, my heart hammering. Unknown number. The assistant's face drained of color. "Don't answer that." I hesitated, but I did. A slow breath came through the line. Then, a voice I didn't recognize. "Drop the story." The line went dead. I lowered the phone. The assistant was staring at me, his face pale. "Who was it?" I swallowed, my throat dry. "Someone who doesn't want this story coming out." Chapter 7: The Cost of Speaking Out. The first sign that my life was about to collapse came early the next morning. It started with something small, an email notification that my login credentials had been revoked. I tried again. Access denied. Then my phone vibrated, an automated message from my bank. "Your account has been temporarily restricted due to security concerns." I knew what this was. I had seen it happen before. When powerful people wanted you silenced, they didn't send men in suits to bang on your door. They didn't always make it obvious. No, they made you disappear in pieces. They went after your credibility, your finances, your ability to function in the world. And now it was happening to me. I tried my credit card at a gas station later that afternoon. Declined. I checked my bank app. Everything was frozen. Savings, checking, even a separate account I had set up under an LLC for freelance work. It was all locked down. That's when the first wave of panic hit me. I had money, but not anymore. They had planned for this. They had planned for me. I drove straight to my editor's office, half expecting him to tell me that this was some kind of mistake, that my credentials had been pulled because of a system error. But the moment I stepped through the glass doors, I knew it was over. The office was tense. People looked away when I walked past their desks. Whispers followed me, but no one said anything. I made it halfway to my editor's door when someone from HR intercepted me. A woman in a stiff blazer, her expression unreadable. "We need to speak with you," she said. I followed her into a conference room where my editor was already seated, rubbing his temples. He wouldn't even look at me. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He sighed. "We're letting you go." The words hit like a slap. I blinked. "What?" "There's too much heat on this story. You should have backed off when I told you to." His voice was tight, controlled, like he was forcing himself to sound professional. "Legal says we can't afford to be attached to this. You're on your own." I stared at him, trying to process what was happening. This was a man I had worked with for years, a man who had sent me on assignments overseas, who had vouched for my work when no one else would. And now, he was cutting me loose. Just like that. "So that's it," I said, laughing bitterly. "They made a few phone calls, and you folded." "This isn't just about them," he snapped. "This is about you, about the choices you're making." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "This isn't just some Hollywood scandal, all right? You don't even know what you're stepping into." I clenched my fists. "Then tell me." "I can't." His jaw tightened. "And if you're smart, you'll stop asking questions." I stood there for a long moment, heart pounding. Then, without another word, I turned and walked out. I went home, locked the door behind me, and started digging. I already knew Diddy had been paying people off. I had seen the wire transfers, the hush money, the NDAs. But what I hadn't fully understood until now was just how deep this went. I pulled up an encrypted folder on my laptop, scanning through the research I had compiled over the past few weeks. Disappeared lawsuits, sealed court documents, witnesses who had gone quiet. And then there was the grand jury investigation, a federal case that was sealed so tight, even former DOJ prosecutors wouldn't talk about it. Something wasn't adding up. This wasn't just about Diddy covering his tracks. This was bigger. And whatever it was enough to get me fired, enough to get my accounts logged, enough to make people scared to even say his name. That's when I realized the assistant hadn't texted me back. My stomach twisted. I tried calling, straight to voicemail. I tried again, nothing. He had told me just the night before that he was being watched, that he had seen a black SUV parked outside his home, that he felt like someone was following him. Now, he was gone. I needed to think. I needed to be smart. I packed a bag, grabbed my hard drives, and drove straight to my storage unit, a place I had rented under a different name just in case. Inside were physical backups of every story I had ever worked on, every leaked document, every source interview. I started going through them, cross-referencing everything I had. The deeper I dug, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't just about one man. This was about a system. Diddy had power, sure, but he wasn't the top of the food chain. He was connected to people in places higher than I had imagined. Executives, politicians, industry elites. The kind of people who don't show up in headlines because they own the headlines. And they were the ones protecting him. I was still reeling from that realization when my phone buzzed. No caller ID. I hesitated before answering. Silence. Then, you haven't even scratched the surface. The line went dead. I stared at my phone, my pulse hammering. Not a threat, not a warning. Message. Someone was watching. Someone wanted me to keep going. But why? And more importantly, who? Chapter 8. The story that won't die. The moment I hit publish, I felt it in my gut. A shift, a pulling sensation, like I had just set something in motion that couldn't be undone. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen as the article loaded onto the site. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from adrenaline, from knowing that this wasn't just another exposé. This was a declaration of war. The piece was over 10,000 words, a full breakdown of Diddy's hidden empire. The NDAs, the hush money, the loyalty tests, the shadowy figures that had protected him for decades. I had detailed the grand jury investigation, the assistant's confession, the missing employees, and the erased footage that wasn't supposed to exist. I had gone after everyone. Not just Diddy, but the executives, the politicians, the investors, the people who had looked the other way while lives were ruined. I named names, I included dates, transactions, receipts. Everything that could be verified, I verified. Everything that couldn't, I presented with supporting evidence. And now it was out there. I didn't expect immediate backlash. I expected worse. At first it was quiet, too quiet. My article started to circulate, getting picked up by smaller sites, independent journalists, Twitter threads. But by the afternoon, it had spread like wildfire. Then the bigger names started talking. The same media outlets that had ignored the allegations before, they were forced to acknowledge it now. People read it, and people were angry. The comment sections were a war zone. Some called me a hero. Others said I was a liar, a sensationalist, a conspiracy theorist. But that didn't matter. The story was out there. It couldn't be taken back. Then, the first attack came. It wasn't subtle. A smear piece, published by a major media outlet, painting me as a disgruntled former journalist who had a history of unsubstantiated claims. Within an hour, there were 3 more articles just like it. They had dug through my past, twisting old mistakes, taking old stories out of context. The strategy was obvious: discredit me before people could take my articles seriously. But it was too late for that. By the time they tried to kill the story, it had already reached millions. I stayed glued to my screen, tracking every update, every response. I kept checking my email, hoping for one thing, a message from the assistant. He hadn't responded since our last meeting. His phone had been shut off. His apartment had been empty. I had gone back twice, and both times, it looked like he had vanished. I sent another text. "Are you safe?" Nothing. I knew I had put him in danger by publishing this story. I just didn't know if he had gotten out in time. Then came the next attack. My phone buzzed with a new notification. Bank alert. I opened my banking app. Restricted. Again. I checked my email. Then my phone. I had seen this before. This wasn't an accident. This was targeted. Someone, somewhere, had made a few calls, and now I was being erased from my own life. They were doing everything they could to cut me off before I could fight back. I slammed my laptop shut, cursing under my breath. I needed a plan. I grabbed my bag. The emergency one. The one with cash. Backup drives. Burner phones. I had prepared for this. I had known this moment would come. What I hadn't prepared for. The knock at my door. I froze. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it was there. 3 sharp knocks. I stayed still, barely breathing. Another knock. I moved silently, reaching for my phone, but of course it wasn't working. I grabbed the burner phone instead. My hands trembled as I typed a quick message to one of my last secure contacts. "Someone's at my door." Then another message to the assistant. "Please tell me you're okay." No response. The knocking stopped. I waited, my entire body rigid, listening for footsteps. Nothing. I stayed like that for 5 full minutes, my heart pounding, my breath shallow. Then, my burner phone buzzed. One new message, no caller ID. I hesitated before opening it. "Is more?" I swallowed hard. Another bus. They'll do anything to keep it buried. I gripped the phone, my mind racing. This wasn't over. Not even close. Someone wanted me to keep digging. But the question was, would I survive long enough to find out why?